Welcome to session 6, Huldah and Jeremiah.
And just to remind you again about prophets, they typically claim the word of the Lord came to them in some way or another, usually by an oracle, sometimes by dreams and other things. They engage in symbolic activities that underline their words, such as the linen girdle in Jeremiah and the potter and the clay in Jeremiah and the cracked earthen jug also in Jeremiah and wearing a yoke. A standard phrase in Jeremiah is woe to you, and they are fundamentally concerned about adherence to the covenant of the Lord, and that lies at the root of much of what they say. And forthtelling about speaking of the present situation, warning of invasions, exiles, judgment from God, or in Jeremiah's case, he'll talk about a return from exile, as we'll also find in Isaiah. And then foretelling, looking into the future, we find this also in Jeremiah, who talks about in 70 years' time, what things might look like then and beyond. And as always, we just remind ourselves that the justice of God is a concern of the prophets, and it's spoken in words of judgment and punishment. And there's also modified, if you like, with the mercy of God, with words of compassion and hope. And we come to our first prophet today, not a well-known prophet. Now, be honest, who has heard of Huldah before? How many of you? Yes. Well, anyone who did the Women in the Bible study with Tuggeranong would know that Huldah is one of the few female prophets to be described so in the Old Testament. She gave advice to King Josiah. She is a contemporary of Jeremiah, which again is not well known. So at the time, Jeremiah was going, woe to you, and speaking his oracles and being thrown in wells. Huldah was also occupying the office, for want of a better word, of prophet in the southern kingdom. She gave particular advice, apparently, on things to do with writing. So she was considered an expert in manuscripts, and one of her gifts is to discern whether a manuscript was from the Lord or whether it was some sort of fake. I think this has probably come from the rabbinic tradition about Huldah. So they unearthed a book of the law in a money chest that had recently been raided to pay for renovations to the temple that obviously had not been opened for some time. And they find in it a book that sets out some requirements of the law. And King Josiah goes into a panic because he thinks, oh dear, what have we done? We haven't been obeying the law properly. So he takes the book to Huldah, and Huldah decrees that it is indeed the word of the Lord and not some forgery that they found. And then Josiah goes about implementing extensive reforms. She's one of who are considered the 7 female prophets in Israel, and some of them a bit more prophety than others. I'm not sure that I think Esther is particularly a prophet, each to their own when you're designating this. Certainly she stands in the tradition of prophets like Miriam and Deborah. That was Huldah's job. And of course, there's a lot hanging on this with Huldah. Having decreed this is the word of the Lord, of course, it changes the course of how Israel is going to behave in the book of Kings, and it's going to reform itself, but maybe not in time for the sort of thing that Jeremiah is talking about. So the big significance of Huldah, of course, is that she's a woman. She's consulted by the king. She has married well because her husband is somebody who seems to be reasonably prominent in the royal court because he's the keeper of the king's wardrobe. And if you know anything about keepers of king's bedchambers, they wielded enormous power because they had the ear of the king and, of course, were in that intimate space with the king. And I have a 13th great-grandfather who was gentleman of the bedchamber to Henry VIII and managed to keep his head. It's true.
Yeah, yes. But what a job. Oh, my hat.
It would be a pretty bad job. But as I said, they wielded enormous power, and I've got no doubt to think it was any different back in Huldah's day.
I just love the thought that one of Elizabeth's ancestors wiped the king's bottom every day.
That's right.
And one of my
when he
other
had the
ancestors saved Henry VIII's life on the battlefield. So John holds me personally responsible for the English Reformation.
Yes, that's right.
Because if it wasn't for Sir Thomas the Magnificent's meddling on the battlefield in France, things might have been different.
And he would have been killed, yes.
That's right. So on we go. So she's not only a woman, but I think the curious thing about Huldah is that, as I said, she's contemporary with Jeremiah, but King Josiah does not consult Jeremiah when this book is found. He takes it to Huldah. So she is preferenced over Jeremiah as far as prophets go at this time. Now, whether that's because she was considered in the tradition to have a specific and special knowledge of text, or whether Jeremiah by this stage had really turned the king off with his, gloomy and baleful warnings about what was to happen, we don't know. But so it's really important that we remember Huldah, and when people tell you that women can't be leaders, she's one of the people that you can point to. So we've got some questions. Yes, Patricia.
Could it possibly be that Jeremiah just wasn't around at the time? He might have been in the country.
Well,
I found a document on the internet which said that Jeremiah had gone to visit the people who had been transported by the Assyrians.
yes, there's lots of documents you'll find online that morass of worthy and credible information that will tell you all sorts of things, mainly because our complementarian friends out there in the evangelical Christian church really tie themselves in knots over the concept that a woman was consulted before a man.
And there's also arguments made by such beasts that Huldah was consulted in private. So she wasn't really exercising the role of a prophet, because prophets prophesy in public.
And Deborah was only a judge because there was no good man to be found.
As one person that I've read said, look at the group that came to him. It wasn't just the king. It was, there were 4 men that are mentioned in the story that came to Huldah. And I think, Piers, the other thing about Jeremiah is that when Jeremiah, I'm not sure about Jeremiah going to Assyria, but he certainly was in exile in Egypt, which of course is the other direction.
Yeah.
I mean, you'll read a lot of excuses about why Huldah was consulted, and they're mostly written by men. They're mostly written by conservative men and conservative white men at that. So I would treat them with the contempt they deserve, personally.
Or at least a hermeneutic of suspicion.
A big hermeneutic of suspicion.
She doesn't pop out of the blue. So, I mean, she must have had a reputation and some existing significance in the court or amongst people who were considered to be worthy of being consulted. Like, this is such an extraordinary thing, isn't it? So I would say she, even though she's not mentioned in other places, she must have had some prior involvement in the court as an advisor.
I guess one of the questions we have, is she extraordinary in the sense that her and Deborah and Miriam are rare, or are we looking at an edited Old Testament mostly put together during the exile by male priests, where only the really most well-known women survived the cut? And we can't answer that.
No, but that seems very logical.
It's quite possible that women prophets were far more common than the Old Testament might lead us to believe, but only the most prominent have survived the cut. So, we're not sure about that. But clearly Deborah and Huldah and Miriam and Abigail and other Sarah are all accepted as having these really important primary roles, even Esther, who doesn't do much, but, she still does stuff. And then you've got others like Jael with her tent peg, who dispatches Sisera. So there are women there that are warriors and who are brave and who are prophets and who are prominent. There was probably more of them than we know about. but we've just lost them in the course of history. So we should celebrate the ones we have, like Huldah, and I hope you won't forget who she is now. We don't get a passage on her in the lectionary, and probably we should when we're going through the narratives. And people should make more of these women than they do. So we've got some questions for you to think about. The main thing that's Huldah's story is being described as the importance of always listening for God's voice wherever it comes from, be that male, female, or talking ass or burning bush. So think about the times when God has communicated with you that you have felt that. Are there unusual sources that have come to you that you feel is coming from God? So we're going to throw you in your breakout rooms. All right, I'll take that as a no then, and we'll move
Well,
on.
I'm prepared to admit
Piers is
that I
prepared
felt I had been called by God to go and work in the PAL. And in fact, although the first time I got that call, I said, no, I can't do it. But the next time it came, and both times it was a visitor who visited our church who asked for someone to go over there. I did go, and in fact, I went another 3 or 4 times.
Well, thanks for sharing that, Piers. So you were visited by a Malachim, a messenger of God in human form. Indeed,
Yeah.
may have been human, but carrying something for you.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of comments we were making, that to use the word God speaks to you is really a difficult thing, because it's not necessarily going to be as clear as someone speaking now, but somehow we get this sense that we're either being pushed towards something or being called towards something, or something is happening that is almost inexplicable. And we have a choice then to either listen as if someone's speaking and do something about it, or not. And nobody's going to stop you, but it's almost indefinable. And to use the word speak sometimes is not actually appropriate.
Yes, we need a better word, don't we?
Prompting?
Prompting, yes, or nudge is a word I often use.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and if you talk to a gaggle of ministers together, they'll often talk about that, because we're all meant to have a sense of call before entering the ministry,
Yes.
which is tested by the church in a number of ways. And you can hear some very different and odd stories indeed about that.
But much more often just new than, although sometimes a person says to you, have you thought? And typically you go, no, not me.
That's my story.
Well, I used to tell people when application forms came raining from heaven, I took it as a sign. That's probably an exaggeration. All right. We'll move on now to looking at Jeremiah.
So Jeremiah lived at a crucial turning point in the history of Israel, that is the remaining southern kingdom of Judah, the southern part of Israel. The northern kingdom, confusingly called Israel, had been conquered by the Assyrians a century before Jeremiah, and we have the story there about the elite classes being taken into exile by the Assyrians, and the land being repopulated with people from other nations, and from that develops the people of that region, which became known as Samaria, and they became known as the Samaritans. The Assyrians had invaded the southern kingdom in the year 701, you might recall, but they were repelled. There's an account of that in 2 Kings. Then away from Israel, Judah, the Babylonian Empire rose, and the Assyrians, it seems, had expanded too rapidly, and so they fell to the Babylonians. And after they had conquered Assyria, they kept on pressing down to the south. The land where Israel has always been a desirable location, not because of the wondrous landscape and soil and all of that. It's a pretty poor place, as I understand it from that point of view, but in terms of its strategic location as the crossroads between Egypt to the southwest and Assyria, Babylon, and Asia, in fact, to the northeast, and also because it's adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea, and therefore ships could sail from Philistia down on the coast across west. So kingdoms always wanted control of that land, and the Babylonians were no exception. And the southern kingdom fell in the year 587, and King says that Judah went into exile out of its land, and they were taken to Babylon, to the northeast. Jeremiah himself was sent into exile at a certain point before that, but he wasn't sent into exile in Babylon. He was part of a group that was sent into exile into Egypt. And he actually maintains contact with the exiles in Babylon by writing to them from his exile in Egypt. So it's a little bit complicated. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet at an early age, and there's some debate amongst the commentators about whether he's in his early 20s or whether he's actually in his teens. And certainly he functioned as a prophet right throughout his life, so probably for 4 decades. The debate is about how one particular word, na'ah, in the call narrative is to be understood. And some commentators say that it's used elsewhere quite often of boys in their teens. At any rate, when Jeremiah heard God declare to him, I appointed you as a prophet to the nations, his response was, ah. And we shouldn't think of that ah as a satisfactory ah. It was an ah, it was a shriek. It was, oh no, what am I in for? Because that's how that word is used elsewhere in Hebrew scriptures. I don't know how to speak, he says. I am only a boy, and ah. So God presses the point with Jeremiah, and he takes up the role of prophet. And he is told in his call that he is to proclaim, in a sense, both God's judgment and also God's hope for repentance by the people, because the exact words are that God instructs Jeremiah to pluck up and pull down, to destroy and overthrow, but to build and to plant. And those words are all quite important in the oracles that Jeremiah gives. So remember last week we talked about call narratives in scripture and how a call narrative contains classically these elements. Yahweh, the Lord, greets the person, gives the person a commission. Inevitably, that person that's being given the commission objects, as we've heard in Jeremiah. There are words of divine reassurance. Do not be afraid. I am with you. I will give you the words, etc. And then there is a sign that comes to confirm the commission. So we looked last week at the call of Isaiah, and we saw that the commission that Isaiah was given, paradoxically, was to say to the people, keep on listening, but do not comprehend, keep on looking, but do not understand, make the mind of this people dull, stop their ears, shut their eyes, etc. It's a very confronting kind of call to have received. And Isaiah also was relatively young when he was called, because he also functioned as a prophet for some decades. So what we thought we would do was invite you to look at the call narrative of Jeremiah, the first 10 verses of chapter 1 of Jeremiah. Unlike Isaiah, where the call narrative is bumped to chapter 6, the book of Jeremiah actually starts with Jeremiah's call as a young person. So have a look at that call narrative and discuss a bit with each other, what traditional call narrative features do you see in the story? What distinctive elements are there? And then you might also like to compare the charge given to Jeremiah with the charge we saw last week given to Isaiah, and think about how those two charges might have similarities, but how there might also be differences between them. So Jeremiah 1 to 10, the call narrative features and how it compares with Isaiah chapter 6.
Well, how did you go? What did you discover about Jeremiah's call narrative?
That he had all the elements.
So all the elements were there. Were they? in the same order as Isaiah?
Well, we didn't look at the order.
No.
Oh, okay. Sometimes order is important with these little pericopes or passages when we're looking at things, and sometimes it isn't. As long as all the different elements are there, you can clearly identify what it is.
I
And
felt
some of them don't make any sense if you don't put them in the right order. So there's who the person is and where they are, and
Yes.
and God
Yeah.
speaking and them responding by saying no way, no how. And so if you don't have those in the right order, then the story doesn't make sense. So
No, that's right.
I felt the sign to confirm the commission was not an obvious sign, and we talked about it being a growing one as he recognised that he had the words.
Yeah. Yeah, Isaiah was pretty dramatic, where he sees this great vision of God and seraphs in this heavenly kind of dimension. There's not too many like that. That's a very colourful call narrative.
You did note how in Isaiah, it was sort of like a mocking tone to the to that line, like you keep listening, but you do not comprehend.
Yeah.
Which is almost close to what you say, Elizabeth.
I actually say you listen and don't remember. It's slightly different. They well comprehended at the time.
well, possibly part of the problem is that the things that they remember are not the things that you wanted them to remember.
Well, how
I've had
true.
people say to me, I remember you saying such and such, and I think, oh, well, I suppose I did, but that wasn't the point I was aiming for.
And it's also true that people will hear things that you actually didn't say, but were hinting at, and take that away as the main point of the sermon. Very interesting how people hear.
So this is a modern day example of probably how people heard prophets back in the day. You take away from it what you thought you heard or what you wanted to hear, and you may even just outright reject it because it would create such a cognitive dissonance with you, what was being said, that where you're saying that possibly couldn't be so, and you just reject it. So there's various ways people hear these sorts of messages. Anything else that you want to share from your groups about Jeremiah? Yes, Jerry.
The Lord knew Jeremiah before all those discussions. In Jeremiah chapter 1:5, the Lord says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born,
Yeah.
I set you the path. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. So Jeremiah was the right person to accomplish God's mission, I guess.
Yes, see, that's exactly right. And that's the whole point of these call narratives, to establish that this is the right person at this time to do and say what God wants them to do and say. And there's some elements here with Jeremiah when it was talk about you appointed me before I was born. There's some elements here of Hannah's child, Samuel, and also the unnamed mother of Samson's prayer, which is very similar. When she prays for a child, she's also barren. And both of them are basically like Nazarites. They've been anointed by God or appointed for that particular position they're going to take up. So Jeremiah is also falling into, or seems to be falling into, that category of someone like a Nazarite that is foreordained in some ways to do these things. Any other comments?
Yes, and Jeremiah, looking at Jeremiah, Jeremiah was obedient to what God told him to do. And say, Jeremiah hoped and prayed for mercy from God for Judah.
Yeah.
But also trusted that God was good, just, and righteous. I think we too must obey God even when it is difficult.
Yes, and Jeremiah certainly faced some serious difficulties in carrying out his commission, and his life was threatened on more of one occasion. But Jerry's right, he always remained faithful and obedient. So we'll move on in our exploration of Jeremiah. So do you want to put the slides back up, John?
Yeah. So I want to remark, first of all, that Jeremiah was not only a prophet, but he was also a priest. The very first verse of his book says the words of Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, of the priests who are in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin. And so that what we know about priests are, especially the priestly redactors of the historical material that were active during and probably after the exile, is that they like order, they like system, they like structure, they like things to be precise. So if we read on, we find that the word of God, the word of the Lord, came to Jeremiah, this priestly character, in the days of King Josiah, son of Amon of Judah, in the 13th year of his reign, and also in the days of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, and until the end of the 11th year of King Zedekiah, son of Josiah of Judah, until the captivity of Jerusalem in the 5th month. Okay, so we've got the whole chronological framework set out there in the opening verses in neat, structured way. And Jeremiah actually gives us precise datings or year datings for a number of his prophecies. And the very last chapter, of course, of Jeremiah, chapter 52, tells of the exile of the people to Babylon. So the whole arrangement of the book overall is chronological from Jeremiah as a young man to the end, towards the end of Jeremiah's life, when Jerusalem is taken into exile, and the governor who's Gedaliah, who's set up there. But the problem is, once you start trying to plot those precise markers, it's a bit like Luke's journey narrative, for those of you who did the Luke course, where we start here and we end there, but we're never quite sure where we are in between, and it seems to kind of go down and come back and jump around. Well, with Jeremiah, as the next slide shows, the book really jumps around in time. It starts with Josiah, then it jumps to Zedekiah, who's in 587. Then it goes back to Jehoahaz in 609, and then follows Jehoiakim. Then it goes to Jehoiachin, called Coniah, in 597, then back to Zedekiah, and then back to Jehoiakim, and then back to Zedekiah, and then back to Jehoiakim, and then to Zedekiah, and then to Gedaliah, the governor, after the Babylonian conquest in chapter 40, but we've still got 12 chapters to go, and we jump right back then in chapter 45 to Jehoiakim before we go back to Zedekiah and the actual fall of Jerusalem. So you can see that the chronological structuring of the book is rather strange. So most interpreters say, well, the book is actually arranged topically. And if we think about it that way, not chronologically, but topically, the first 25 chapters are prophecies, largely in poetic form, about Israel from the mouth of Jeremiah. Then there's 20 chapters, largely narrative prose, so a different style, different literary style, about Jeremiah and things that happened to him in his life, including some of his oracles. And then we jump back to poetic prophecy form, 6 chapters of oracles against the foreign nations, and then the final historical chapter. So to put all of that into the framework, our friends from the Bible Project will help us.
The book of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was an Israelite priest who lived and worked in Jerusalem during the final decades of the kingdom of southern Judah. He was called as a prophet to warn Israel about the severe consequences of breaking their covenant with God through their idolatry and injustice, and he even predicted that the empire of Babylon would come as God's servant to bring this judgment on Israel by destroying Jerusalem, taking the people into exile. And sadly, his words became reality. Jeremiah lived through the siege and destruction of Jerusalem and witnessed the exile personally. Now, this book came into existence in a really interesting way. Chapter 36 tells us that after 20 years of Jeremiah's preaching in Jerusalem, God called him to collect all of his sermons and poems and essays and commit them to writing, which Jeremiah did by employing a scribe named Baruch, who wrote down and compiled all of this material into a scroll. Now, Baruch also gathered lots of stories about Jeremiah, and he linked all the pieces together. And so this is why the book reads like an anthology, a collection of collections. It's all been arranged to present this prophet as a messenger of God's justice and grace. So the book begins with God calling Jeremiah to be a prophet, and he's given a dual vocation. He will be a prophet to Israel, but also to the nations. And his words will both uproot and tear down, but also plant and build up. In other words, he's going to accuse Israel and warn them of God's coming judgment, but he also has a message of hope for the future. Now, this opening perfectly summarizes the first large section, chapters 1 to 24. It's a collection of Jeremiah's writings from before the exile. And the core idea here is that Israel has broken the covenant with God and violated all the terms of the agreement they made that are written in the Torah. And in a number of ways. They've adopted the worship of all kinds of Canaanite gods, building idol shrines all over the land. And Jeremiah develops the metaphor of idolatry as adultery and uses the language of prostitution, promiscuity, unfaithfulness to describe how Israel has given their allegiance to other gods. Jeremiah also repeatedly accuses Israel's leaders. The priests, the kings, the other prophets have all become corrupt. They've abandoned the Torah and the covenant, which has led to a tragic result: rampant social injustice. The most vulnerable people in Israelite communities, the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, were all being taken advantage of in clear violation of the laws of the Torah, and Israel's leaders didn't even seem to care. So a classic place where all of these ideas come together is in chapter 7. It's called Jeremiah's Temple Sermon. The Israelites are coming to worship their God in the temple as if everything is just fine, but outside the temple they are worshiping other gods, and some were even adopting the horrifying Canaanite practice of child sacrifice. And so Jeremiah makes his very unpopular announcement. The God of Israel is coming in judgment. He's going to destroy his own temple and punish Israel by sending an enemy from the north. This is an army that God would allow to conquer Jerusalem, and as you read on, you discover he's talking about the great empire of Babylon. And so this all leads up to a transition in chapter 25. Israel hasn't turned back to their God, and so in the first year of Babylon's new king, Nebuchadnezzar, God tells Jeremiah to announce that the Babylonian armies are headed for Israel and all of its neighbors to conquer them and take them into exile for 70 years. He compares Babylon to a cup of wine filled to the brim with God's just anger at all of Israel's injustice and idolatry, and God will make Israel and the nations drink from this cup. Now, this chapter is key to the book's design because everything that follows is going to focus on Babylon's coming attack. First on Israel in chapters 26 to 45, and then on the other nations in chapters 46 to 51. The section about Israel first contains stories about how Jeremiah begged Israel to turn back, how he warned them right up to the last minute, but the leaders of Israel kept rejecting him. This section concludes with a large collection of stories about how Jerusalem was under siege and eventually destroyed by Babylon, and about how Jeremiah was persecuted all through that time and eventually kidnapped and taken against his will to Egypt by a group of Israelite rebels. Now, right here in the middle, in between all of these dark stories of disaster and judgment, is a collection of Jeremiah's messages of hope for Israel's future. So he picks up on Moses' prediction that after Israel had broken the covenant and gone into exile, see Deuteronomy 30, God would not abandon his people. Rather, he would renew his covenant with them and transform their hearts. Jeremiah develops this promise, and he says that God is going to one day inscribe the laws of the Torah, not on tablets, but rather on the hearts of his own people. He's going to heal their rebellion so that they can truly one day love and follow him fully. And so one day, Israel will return back to the land, and the Messiah from the line of David is going to come, and that's when all nations will come to recognize Israel's God as the true God. So these chapters are showing that despite Israel's apostasy, God is not going to let Israel's sin get the final word. Rather, his own faithfulness will bring about the fulfillment of his promises, no matter what. After this, we find the large collection of poems about how God is going to use Babylon to judge the nations around Israel. So Egypt, Philistia, Moab, Edom, Ammon, Damascus, Hazor. But then, surprisingly, the longest poems are saved for last, and they're about God's coming judgment on Babylon itself. So although God used this nation to execute his justice, God doesn't endorse their violence and idolatry. And so Babylon too will come under the standard of God's justice. And so Jeremiah denounces this nation's pride and injustice as well. Now, Babylon is larger than life in these poems, and it reminds us of the image of Babylon all the way back from Genesis chapter 11. Babylon has become the archetypal rebellious nation. In their glorification of wealth and war, God's going to give this nation over to its own destruction. The book concludes with a story taken from the end of the book of 2 Kings. It tells about Babylon's final attack on Jerusalem, how they destroyed the city walls and burned the temple and took the people into exile. The story shows how Jeremiah's warnings of judgment from chapters 1 through 24 were fulfilled. But then the chapter ends with a short story about the captive Israelite king Jehoiakim. He's heir to the line of David. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and shows him favor and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life. And that's how the book ends. So it's a little glimmer of hope. And this recalls Jeremiah's promises of hope from chapters 30 to 33. God hasn't abandoned his people or the promise of a future coming king from David's line. And so while this book contains a huge amount of warning and judgment, the final words conclude with a note of hope for the future. And that's what the book of Jeremiah is all about.
I think that the Bible Project does a wonderful job of explaining how what we have is not just a chronological narrative about all the things that happened to Jeremiah and that he said, but actually a constructed, or they call an anthology of anthologies, a constructed work that that collates all kinds of material relating to Jeremiah. And in fact, Jeremiah himself tells us that he employs Baruch, the scribe, in order to do that. So in his commentary on Jeremiah, in the Erdman's commentary on the Bible, Pete Diamond says, like it or not, we have no direct access to the historical figure of Jeremiah or to his cultural matrix. And because he's an academic, he has to use complicated phrases. So he says what we actually have is interpretative representations rather than raw cultural transcripts. In other words, everything has been mediated by at least Baruch, if not further people in the construction, the compiling, the editing, the putting together of this book. So I wonder, this is a really interesting case study in what a lot of the so-called historical aspects of Scripture is like. How do you respond to this notion that we have no direct access to the historical figure of Jeremiah? We only have interpretative representations by others, other people, Baruch and others, saying this is what Jeremiah was like, this is what Jeremiah said. How do you respond to that claim about the difficulty of getting to the historical figure? And so that's the challenge that's set for the next group discussion.
So what did you feel about the statement? We have no direct access to the historical figure of Jeremiah, but interpretive representations.
We said, so how is that different from any other information we have about any other people at that time?
Yes, fair point. Yes, that's a very good point. It's probably not that much different from anyone else at that time. Any other comments?
I'm getting over it.
Oh, poor Patricia. She's been confronted with the interpretive nature of the Bible, and that's beaten her around the ears.
Well, the only other comment I would make, listening to Patricia, but perhaps it's been the lived experience of many of us to discover that actually there's very little in the Bible that you can pin down. It's all pretty well interpretive in one form or another. And we have to come to terms with that. And we weren't terribly surprised or flawed by that.
No, and given a lot of it was probably some sort of oral history and then written down much later in exile, you're relying on traditions and memories and different stories that are then woven together. So it makes perfect sense that you don't actually have an autobiography or biographical account written by someone who wants to establish factual veracity.
It's interesting that today we put an awful lot of weight on our oral history that's passed around on the social network, and rather than really, well, find the facts, what the facts really are. So we're
Yep.
always relying on
Mm.
some dubious information, or
Yes.
we're having trouble with dubious information all the time.
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a lot of dubious information on the internet, and just because it's on the internet and you think it sounds all right doesn't make it true.
Mm.
That's precisely right. It's got to be sifted and weighed and research done to make sure that you understand what is being said. Well, we might move on now to our next section.
Can I just say that the other thing is that the fact that you wrote it doesn't necessarily mean that you're trying to make it a factual thing about you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You may be writing in a poetic way, or you may be filling out some of those missing gaps, or giving it backstory, or all sorts of things you can do. That's exactly right, Judy.
Who I am on Facebook is not necessarily who I am at 46 Michael Holt Crescent.
That's damn right. I'll back up
Oh,
that statement.
Ah, now you're wondering. Okay.
I'm shocked.
what are you telling us, John?
There's a high degree of correlation, but it's not an exactitude.
Okay.
So, in working through the book of the prophet Jeremiah again, I was struck in what is there in the resource that you have about the way God tries to deal with this whole business about the people have sinned, they're idolatrous, they're perpetrating social injustice. I'm not going to look on you in anger, says God, I'm merciful. But then he says to the people, put on sackcloth and lament and wail. And then he says, I'm going to devour you. I'm going to make you a desolation, an uninhabited land. And chapters 1 to 25, God actually is wrestling back and forth about what to do about these people. If God really is a God of mercy, won't he just forgive them? But if he's a God of justice, won't he hold them to account? And that is, in a sense, transferred to or conveyed by Jeremiah. So in that sense, he's really been gripped by the Spirit of the Lord. The Spirit of the Lord is anguishing about the people. Jeremiah too is anguishing about the people. So I think it's important to kind of frame this bit about the confessions of Jeremiah in that way. That's my sense, that he is really channeling God. And so a lot of his oracles are trying to work that out and trying to get the people to pay attention to what is going on in the divine realm, if you like, so that they they will respond accordingly. Now, there are passages that have been called by the scholars Jeremiah's confessions, and that is confess in the sense of confessing the pain and the grief that he's experiencing for his people. Of course, Jeremiah has really taken on board the situation of his people, the people where he lives. And even when he's whisked off into exile, he still has a heart for what's happening in the land of Judah. So his confessions are praying to God for a release from the condition for himself and for the people. And it's been noted that there are a lot of stylistic and theological similarities with the many Psalms of lament. They're the Psalms where the psalmist seems to get really angry with God and really lets it out in God's presence, and then says, but I know, I trust you are a God of steadfast love and mercy, and that you will save me from this, or save the people from this. There are Psalms of individual lament. There are Psalms of communal lament. So thought, taking all of that, it would be interesting to spend a little bit of time thinking about Jeremiah's laments, about how he deals with the way, the situation that he's experiencing of being amongst this people that are being caught by oppressors, by the Babylonians, pressing on them and then eventually taking them into exile. And we'll So we'll start thinking about this week, and next week we'll do a bit more on Jeremiah, and then we'll do something on the book of Lamentations, which is linked with Jeremiah, where this kind of lamenting, obviously Lamentations, takes place. But maybe once again, is there a way that you might connect with this from your own experience of grief or pain in difficult circumstances, and about how you have worked through that, and how God is involved in that process of sorting that out? Can we bring our complaints to God? Can we bring our complaints to God? Can we pray to God, please show mercy to me or to us? So they're the questions to take into this next group discussion.
So how did you go with the topic of lament? Can we lament easily?
Oh, too easily, I reckon.
Too easily?
Have a good whinge.
But can we do it to God?
Yes.
Patricia does.
Well, look at the Psalms and even Jesus in Gethsemane, you know, I don't like what's coming. Can you take that cup from me?
Yeah.
And the cry of abandonment on the cross. I mean, that we've got all the examples we need to say it is okay to rail at God.
But it's not often something we see in church or in prayer groups or whatever, just the same. There's a different understanding of how you approach God in public.
Yes.
Yes, we tend to confess.
Yeah, and how often do you say sorry after you've done your big rail? Sorry, God. Yeah.
Well, that's true. That is true.
Yeah.
But yes, in public worship, we tend to focus on praise and very rarely lament in worship.
Yeah.
That would make an interesting church service, wouldn't it?
Well, even our lament is really polite. We, you know, I've seen services of lament, and they just don't say, "Come on, God, get your act together," which is what some of the psalmists are actually saying. Come on, God,
right. Yeah.
where are you? What are you doing?
Yeah,
That's
get
right.
up. Yeah, wake up now. We need your help right now.
Yeah.
Basically, get your sorry butt right here and save us now.
Yes. We have this whole idea that I seem to get the sense that people feel if you do that, you're doing it because you don't either believe in God or you don't have faith in God. But it takes an enormous amount of faith to be able to turn around and say to God, I don't understand what's going on. Why don't you do something about it? You know? Yeah.
I like one of the ladies in our group, she said it's a way to process, so that you start with the situation that is disturbing you and upsetting you. And by talking with God in that relationship, you are processing what is happening. And through that, often you will get an idea of how to handle it, or trust that God will help you through that situation.
Yeah. Yeah, that's probably makes good sense. And I think a lot of the Psalms of Lament, and with Jeremiah too, it does start with the situation. That's exactly what gives rise to the lament.
Yeah.
If you read the Psalms around when they were being invaded by Babylon and the atrocities that were being committed in the war by the Babylonians, and you read the Psalms of Lament at that time, they're terrible. In terms of the, you know, awful things that people are seeing and that they're grappling with and what they're saying. And that's exactly where they start with the situation.
We're going to come back to this, as I've said, next week, because we'll have half the session on Lamentations, and this I've got some other resources to throw in for our consideration for next week.
It may be very appropriate, considering all that we could lament at the moment from Ukraine and Ukraine, that it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
Now, the book of Jeremiah's got 52 chapters. We can't possibly do it justice even in these two sessions. So next week, we're going to look at Isaiah 29, which is his wonderful letter to the exiles in Babylon, and then a passage that everyone in the Christian church knows from Jeremiah 31 about the new covenant. And then we're going to look at a bit more at Lamentations. But before we do that, there's one other, and there's a whole lot of other stuff in Jeremiah that we won't be canvassing, but I thought it just worthwhile noting at the conclusion of this session that Jeremiah becomes very specific in chapter 25 about how God's judgment's going to happen. Because he says, first, the whole land shall become a ruin and a waste, and these nations shall serve the king of Babylon for 70 years. So he talked about it in exact time, not just sometime in the future or soon or in a long time, but 70 years. And then the next verse is that after 70 years are completed, I will punish the king of Babylon and that nation, the land of the Chaldeans, for their iniquity, and make that land an everlasting waste. And so God then declares, I will gather the remnant of my flock and will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. And that's the return to the land. Now, the 70 years has occasioned quite some debate amongst scholars, particularly the more conservative scholars and particularly the Seventh-day Adventists, who take this eschatological kind of statement very seriously. The 70 years also appears in Daniel, and then it determines how SDAs interpret the book of Revelation and what they think about the future. So is this meant to be exact? As you can see in your notes, that there's a scholarly debate about this. And if you start with the first deportation that takes place to Babylon in 605, then 70 years after that is 536, 535, which is when under Ezra, the people have been back in the land and the temple reconstruction begins. Or if you take it at the time that the temple is destroyed, 586, then 70 years is where the temple under Ezra and Nehemiah is completed, 515. So you've got your 70 years, give or take a year, either way there. And as you can see, some other people have said, oh, God was going to do 70 years. So if you go from 587 to 520, the return, that's only kind of 65 years or so. If God was going to make it 70 years, but God changed his mind and took pity on the people and shortened it. But it's only a shortening of a few years. Of course, the other possibility is that we don't take such numbers literally, that we just understand 70 to mean a few generations. And that Jeremiah is saying that this punishment is going to last quite a while, but it's not going to be forever. So the question to leave you with is really, is it important to have a literal view of such numbers or not?
Can I ask the question, John, what calendar are they basing those years on?
Oh, well, that's translating the years into our calendar.
Okay, righto.
I mean, a year was still a year, even if the months were organised differently. Like the Jewish calendar is done by the lunar calculations. Yeah.
Well, that's 13 months, isn't it?
Well, it's a little bit under 30, yeah.
Yeah, kind of. They're 4 weeks, where our months are slightly longer than 4 weeks in the solar calendar.
So for Jews, some years are longer than others because there's an extra month at it. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Yeah. So I mean,
but I mean, to me, that would possibly explain, the few years discrepancy.
It's much more likely, Patricia, that it's just symbolic. It's like 40 years in the desert or the wilderness, or 100 days wandering, or 12 generations, or all of that. They're all symbolic numbers, and basically they just mean a long time.
Yes.
Once you run out of toes and fingers to count, it's a long time.
And this is 10 lots of 7, and 7 is important. And
yeah, that's right.
Bye-bye, Jerry.
Yes, we can get all tangled up with the
Yeah,
theology of
exactly.
numbers if we start going down. And I have members in my family who do. So,
Right.
but really at the end of the day, it's just a number. And it's
That's right. It's also the number of a lifespan that's given somewhere else where you've got that 70 years and 10.
Years and 10.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's probably picking up on the idea that it's a full lifetime before you come back. So it's not meant to be exact, but those of you who are young people now will be old or dead when people are returning, basically, is the implication.
Mm.
Possibly the whole thing of you're not going to live to see people coming back because you're the people that have done the wrong thing or not done the right thing, or that kind of.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So it's probably a representative number rather than an exact number. Otherwise, you'd have to question why everything in the Bible's numbers ends in a 0, which seems highly implausible.
Yes.
Okay, so we're suggesting that next week you might like to read chapters 29 to 33, because both of the passages we'll be looking at will come from there. You could read also chapters 36 and 52 to give the historical details from those narratives, if you wish. And then the Book of Lamentations only has 5 chapters, so it's fairly short. And don't read it just before you go to sleep, expecting to have pleasant dreams. So next week, Jeremiah and Lamentations, and thanks for participating today.